She had once refused this man. Stood in his garden on a Tuesday afternoon in June, with the roses in full bloom and the light coming gold through the trees and her whole future arranged before her like something out of a novel, and told him no. She had been kind about it. She had used the right words. Deeply honored, cannot in good conscience, hope you understand. The words a well-raised young woman used when she was turning down a duke and wished to do it without cruelty. He had listened to all of it with his hands behind his back and his face very still, and when she finished he had said I understand and meant it, and that had almost been the worst part. She had walked home through the summer afternoon and felt nothing but certainty. That was 2 years ago. Before Edward. Before the letters from the bank. Before the morning her father sat down at the breakfast table and told her, in the voice of a man who had been awake all night arriving at words, that there was nothing left. Now she was standing in the entrance hall of Elmsworth Park with a letter of reference in her gloved hand. Gloves she had mended twice, carefully, so the mending didn't show, and the housekeeper's position was hers if she wanted it. And she wanted it, because wanting it was a luxury she could not afford to refuse. The man who had loved her was somewhere in this house. He did not know she was here. She intended to keep it that way. The letter of reference was from her mother's cousin in Shropshire. It described a woman of excellent character, diligent habits, and considerable experience managing a household of some complexity. All of this was true, in the way that letters of reference were always true, carefully, selectively, with the inconvenient parts left in the margins where no one would think to look. It did not mention that the woman in question had grown up in a house twice the size of this one. It did not mention that she had learned to manage a household not as an employee, but as a daughter, watching her mother move through rooms like this with the easy authority of someone who had been born knowing where everything belonged. It did not mention that she had once been invited to these rooms as a guest. Vivienne Ashby. She had taken her mother's maiden name, quietly, without announcement, because Hartwell was a name that people in this county recognized, and recognition was the one thing she could not afford. Read the letter over once more in the carriage, then folded it and put it away and looked out the window at the approaching house. Elmsworth Park. Gray stone, 3 stories, a sweep of drive that curved through grounds kept with the precise, unhurried care of a place that had always had money and had never needed to think about it. She had been here before, not many times, 4 perhaps 5, but enough to know the particular quality of light that came through the south-facing windows in the afternoon, enough to know that the third step on the main staircase creaked, enough to know that the roses along the east wall bloomed 2 weeks later than anyone expected them to because the wall threw shade in the mornings. She knew these things the way you knew the geography of a place you had once thought might become yours. She set that knowledge aside, filed it somewhere she did not intend to visit. The carriage stopped. She got out. Mr. Graves met her at the servants' entrance. He was a tall man of around 60, with the bearing of someone who had spent 40 years being the most dignified person in any given room and had no intention of stopping. He looked at her letter of reference with the attention of a man reading a legal document, which, in its way, it was, and then looked at her with the same attention. She met his gaze steadily. She had practiced this, the particular quality of steadiness that was not defiance and not submission, but something in between, the look of a woman who was exactly where she had chosen to be and did not require anyone's opinion on the matter. Mr. Graves folded the letter. Your previous position. I managed my family's household for 6 years. This was true. They no longer require the position. Also true, in the way the letter of reference was true. References beyond this letter, Mrs. Cavendish in Shropshire, will speak to my character. I have her address, Mr. Graves looked at her for another moment, with the impression of a man who noticed things and filed them in places he did not necessarily intend to revisit immediately. The position is demanding, he said. His Grace keeps irregular hours. He has guests frequently and occasionally without notice. He is not difficult to work for, but he is particular. I understand. The previous housekeeper was with us 11 years. The staff are accustomed to a certain, he paused, consistency. I will endeavor to provide it. Another pause. Then Mr. Graves nodded once, with the finality of a man who had made a decision and was not going to revisit it. Very well, Mrs. Ashby. I'll show you to your room. Her room was small and clean and looked out over the kitchen garden. She stood at the window for a moment after Mr. Graves left, looking at the neat rows of it, the winter vegetables, the herb beds, the stone wall at the far end with the espaliered pear trees spread flat against it like pressed flowers. She had stood at a window in this house before, looking at a different view, the formal gardens, the fountain, the lawn rolling away toward the ha-ha, and felt the particular pleasure of a place that was beautiful and might, conceivably, become hers. She felt nothing like that now. Or rather, she felt things, but she had become very good at feeling them in a contained way, at a distance from herself, the way you watched weather through glass. She unpacked her bag. She had brought very little, 2 dresses, both dark, both practical, both chosen to be invisible. A book. Her mother's pearl earrings, which she did not wear because they were the wrong thing for a housekeeper to wear, but which she could not bring herself to sell, not yet, not while there was any other option. She put the earrings at the bottom of the bag and smoothed the fabric over them and told herself this was temporary. She had been telling herself this was temporary for 8 months. She was beginning to understand that temporary was a word that meant something different when you were living inside it than when you were looking at it from the outside. She met the staff at 4 o'clock. Mr. Graves assembled them in the servants' hall, 8 people, ranging from a kitchen maid who could not have been more than 14, and looked at Vivienne with the wide assessing eyes of a young animal evaluating a new element in its environment, to a footman of around 40 named Harris, who had the look of a man who had seen several housekeepers come and go, and had learned to withhold judgment until evidence was available. Vivienne stood at the head of the room, looked at each of them in turn, and said the things that needed saying. She was looking forward to working with them. She understood they had their established ways of doing things and had no intention of disrupting what was working. Her door was open. Her expectations were clear. Her temper was not short. She said all of this in a voice that was even and warm and entirely composed. What she did not say, she had stood in rooms like this before on the other side of the arrangement. She had sat at dinner tables where people exactly like her current self had served her, without her once wondering what their lives looked like when they went back through the door at the end of the evening. She thought about this as she spoke. Filed it. Did not revisit it. The kitchen maid, her name was Dot, continued to watch her with the intensity of a small, clever animal. Vivienne found herself involuntarily charmed. She did not see the Duke that first day. She knew he was in the house. She heard him once in the late afternoon, his voice in the corridor above, speaking to someone about something she couldn't catch. She recognized his voice immediately, which she had anticipated and braced for, and the bracing helped mostly. She had prepared for this. She had prepared for all of it with the thoroughness of a woman who understood that feeling things was inevitable, and falling apart was not. She had prepared for his voice. for the possibility of passing him in a corridor, for the particular way he had of occupying a room, not loudly, but completely, the way a fire filled a room with warmth without moving. What she had not entirely prepared for was that evening, in the kitchen, with the silver. It had been a long day. She had walked every room, catalogued every cupboard, assessed every system that Mr. Graves had maintained for 11 years, and found most of it excellent and some of it in need of quiet revision. She had eaten supper with the staff and said the right things and listened more than she spoke. She had, in every way she could measure, done the thing she had come here to do. Now it was 9 o'clock and the house was settling, and she was in the kitchen with the silver service, which needed polishing before the week was out, and she had offered to begin because she needed something to do with her hands. She was halfway through the third piece when she heard the footstep. She did not look up immediately. She identified the footstep first, not Mr. Graves, not Harris. Heavier, less pattern to it, not the footstep of a man moving from one defined task to another, but of a man walking through his own house without particular destination. She looked up. He was standing in the kitchen doorway. 2 years since the garden, since I understand, since she had walked home through the summer afternoon feeling nothing but certainty. He looked not different exactly. The same dark hair, the same way of standing that was somehow both still and watchful, the same face that had never been easy to read and had apparently not become any easier in the intervening time. He looked, she thought, like a man who had lived carefully through 2 years and had the quietness of it somewhere behind his eyes. He looked at her. Not with recognition, she had known he wouldn't recognize her, had counted on it, the changed name, the changed clothes, the changed everything, but with the attention he apparently gave most things. Steady, unhurried. "You're the new housekeeper," he said. "Yes, Your Grace, Mrs. Ashby, yes." He looked at the silver laid out on the cloth before her, at her hands, at the piece she was holding, half-polished, caught mid-task. "You polish silver," he said, "as though you've done it before." Something moved through her, quick, contained, gone. "Everyone has done something before, Your Grace," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer. She kept her eyes on the silver. She could feel his gaze the way you felt a change in the weather, not dramatically, not with alarm, but as a registered shift in the quality of the air around you. Then he said good night and left, and she listened to his footstep recede down the corridor. She put down the piece of silver, picked it up again. Her hands were not entirely steady. She noted this with the detached interest of a woman cataloging information about herself from a slight distance. That will pass, she told herself. She polished the silver until it was done, went to bed, and lay in the dark of her small, clean room with the kitchen garden outside the window and told herself, with the particular firmness of someone who had survived considerably worse than this, that it would. The first week passed in the way that first weeks did, quickly on the surface, slowly underneath. On the surface, rooms assessed, systems revised, staff observed, patterns established. Vivienne moved through Elmsworth Park with the quiet efficiency of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and had the additional advantage of knowing the house itself, its rhythms, its cold spots, the particular draft that came under the library door in the evenings, the way the dining room acoustics carried sound from the sideboard to the head of the table if you weren't careful. She used this knowledge without appearing to have it. This required a continuous, low-level effort that she performed automatically, the way you performed any skill that had been practiced until it lived in the body rather than the mind. She paused a half-second longer than necessary before knowing where a thing was. She asked Mr. Graves' questions she already knew the answers to. She moved through the house as though discovering it rather than remembering it, and if this felt like a particular kind of dishonesty, she reminded herself that it was also a particular kind of survival, and survival had its own ethics. Underneath, it was slower. Underneath, every day was a series of small, managed moments. A voice in a corridor, a silhouette through a doorway, the particular quality of quiet that settled over a room he had recently left. She managed each one. Filed it. Moved on. She was very good at this by now. Mr. Graves watched her. She had expected this. He was a man who watched, who catalogued, who maintained his own careful accounting of the people in his orbit. She did not mind being watched by him, particularly. She had nothing to hide from the watching, only from the asking, and Mr. Graves, she was discovering, was a man who asked very little directly. What he did do was test her. Not obviously, not unkindly even, but she noticed. The way he mentioned something about the guest rooms in passing that required her to know which exposure they faced. The way he referenced a dinner from 3 years ago in a way that assumed familiarity with how such dinners were run. Small things, the kind of things a woman with her stated background might plausibly know or plausibly not know. And he was, she understood, filing her answers. She gave him enough. Not too much. She had calibrated this carefully in the weeks before she arrived, understanding that the story had to be consistent and the consistency had to be effortless, because effortful consistency was its own kind of tell. On the 5th day he said, with the air of a man making an observation rather than an inquiry, "You have very good instincts for a house of this size, Mrs. Ashby." "Thank you, Mr. Graves. One develops them, of course, with experience." "One does," she agreed, and moved on to the next item on her list. He watched her go. She felt it and did not look back. The staff were warming to her, slowly, in the way of people who had established loyalties and were not in the business of transferring them quickly. Dot had decided within 48 hours that Vivienne was an acceptable addition to the household, and communicated this through the medium of leaving an extra biscuit on Vivienne's supper plate without comment. Harris, the footman, had moved from suspended judgment to something approaching cautious approval after Vivienne handled a minor crisis involving a broken wine glass and a visiting steward with an efficiency that he apparently found professionally satisfying. The one exception was a woman named Mrs. Peel. She was the lady's maid, or had been, before the Duke's mother had died 2 years ago and left the position without clear purpose. She now functioned in a vague capacity that seemed to involve a great deal of opinion and not a great deal of defined responsibility, and she had taken against Vivienne with the quiet, consistent dedication of a woman who had decided on a position and intended to maintain it. It was never overt, Mrs. Peel was too clever for overt. It was the small, precise things. A remark delivered in Vivienne's hearing about the previous housekeeper's methods, implying that any deviation was a kind of arrogance. A question about Vivienne's background posed in front of the other staff with an innocence that was entirely performed. A look exchanged with one of the older kitchen maids when Vivienne used a word that was perhaps too educated for the story she was telling about herself. Vivienne absorbed each one. She did not react. She had learned in the last 2 years that reaction was a luxury and silence was a strategy, and she was very committed to her strategy. But she noted it, filed it, understood that Mrs. Peel was a problem that would need managing, and that the managing would need to be careful. It was on the 8th day that the guests arrived. She knew they were coming. She had organized it, the rooms prepared, the menus discussed, the carriages arranged. 4 people, Sir Edmund and Lady Forsyth, their daughter Miss Clara Forsyth, and a Mr. Aldridge, who was apparently a friend of the Duke's from his years at university, and came and went from Elmsworth with the easy frequency of someone who considered himself family, without the inconvenience of actually being so. Vivienne had managed visiting guests before. She knew the rhythms of it, the arrival, the rooms, the particular requirements of people who were accustomed to having their requirements met. She managed it efficiently and invisibly, the way good household management was always meant to be invisible, present only in the absence of problems. What she had not anticipated was Lady Forsyth. She came face to face with her in the entrance hall, quite unavoidably, when Lady Forsyth arrived ahead of the others and found herself in need of directions to her room before the footman appeared. Vivienne provided them. Lady Forsyth received them. And then Lady Forsyth's eyes, moving over Vivienne with the automatic assessing quality of a woman of her class looking at a woman of apparently lower station, caught. Stopped. Refocused. Vivienne saw it happen, the recognition working its way through, uncertain at first, then more certain, then arrested by the collision between what the eyes were reporting and what the context made possible. Vivienne Hartwell, she could see Lady Forsyth thinking. But that's she can't be. Why would she be? Vivienne met her gaze. And in that moment, without words, she asked, clearly, directly, in the way that only eyes could ask something the mouth could not say in a servant's entrance with a footman approaching. Please. Lady Forsyth looked at her for one more moment. Then she looked away, adjusted her gloves, thanked Vivienne for the directions in the tone of a woman thanking a housekeeper for directions, and moved toward the stairs. Vivienne let out a breath so small it barely counted as a breath. The evening was difficult. Not visibly. Nothing about Vivienne's evenings was ever visibly difficult. But she was in and out of the dining room throughout the meal, overseeing, ensuring, the continuous quiet management that a dinner of this kind required. And the dining room meant the table. And the table meant the Duke, at its head, and his guests arranged along it, and conversation that moved the way dinner conversation moved. Topics picked up and put down, laughter at the expected moments, the particular performance of ease that people of this world had practiced so long it had become genuine. She knew this performance. She had been inside it. Now she was outside it, and the outside looked exactly as she would have expected if she had thought to look the same, but with all the warmth pointed inward. She moved around the table, not listening to the conversation, or trying not to, focusing on the mechanics of it, the glasses, the courses, the timing. Harris at the sideboard, doing his job well. Dot visible through the service door, doing hers. She was refilling the water at the far end of the table when she heard her own name. Not Ashby. Hartwell. It came from Mr. Aldridge said quietly, to the Duke, in the way of someone sharing something mildly interesting. Hartwell, wasn't there a family locally? Lost everything rather spectacularly last year. Debts, I heard, and some business with she did not hear the rest. She had moved away from that end of the table with the steady, unhurried pace of someone who had not heard anything, who was focused on the glass in her hand, and the table before her and nothing else. She did not look at the Duke. She could feel Lady Forsyth not looking at her either, with the determined focus of a woman looking very hard at her plate. She finished her circuit of the table, went through the service door, and stood in the narrow passage outside for precisely 4 seconds. Then she went back in and finished the evening. It was afterward, when the guests had gone to the drawing room and the dining room was being cleared, that she found herself alone in the room for a moment. Harris sent for something, Back to the kitchen, the brief window of stillness that occurred between one part of an evening and the next. She was straightening a chair that didn't need straightening when she became aware that she was not alone. The Duke was in the doorway. He did not come in. He stood at the threshold with a glass of port in one hand, and the expression of a man who had come looking for something, and found something else instead. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Your guests are in the drawing room, Your Grace," she said. "I'm aware." He did not move. "You missed a course at dinner." She had not missed a course. She knew she had not missed a course. "I apologize. I'll review the timing with Harris." It wasn't a criticism, a pause. It was an observation. She waited. "Mr. Aldridge," he said carefully, "made a remark this evening. About a local family." He watched her face with the attention she was learning to expect from him, steady, unhurried, giving nothing away while apparently trying to take everything in. "I want to make sure it didn't cause any discomfort." She looked at him steadily. "Not at all, Your Grace." A pause. He seemed to be deciding something. "This household," he said finally, "does not take its social cues from the dinner table conversation of its guests. I want that to be clear." Vivienne held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said. He nodded. Left. She stood in the empty dining room and looked at the door he had gone through and felt something she had not felt in a long time, something small and inconvenient and entirely unwelcome. She identified it with the detached precision of a woman who had become very good at identifying things she would rather not feel. Gratitude, she thought. Gratitude, and something underneath the gratitude that is considerably more dangerous. She straightened the chair that still didn't need straightening. Then she went to find Harris and discussed the timing of the courses. The guests left 2 days later. Lady Forsyth, on her way out, passed Vivienne in the entrance hall and stopped. She looked at her with the expression of a woman who had been thinking about something for 48 hours and had arrived at a position. "Mrs. Ashby," she said. "Lady Forsyth," a pause. Then quietly, in a voice pitched only for Vivienne, "You were always rather remarkable, my dear. I find I am not surprised that you have landed on your feet." She adjusted her gloves. "Though I confess I had imagined something rather different." She left before Vivienne could find an answer. Vivienne stood in the entrance hall and thought, so had I. It was the library that undid her, or began to undo her. Or perhaps, she thought later, it was simply the moment when something she had been managing very carefully began to be slightly too large for the management. She was in there on a Thursday afternoon, reorganizing the shelves, a task she had invented for herself, because the shelves were perfectly organized already, and she needed something to do in the library that wasn't simply standing in it, which she had been doing with an increasingly suspicious frequency. She was working along the far wall when she heard him come in. She did not turn around immediately. She continued working, because she was a housekeeper reorganizing shelves, and that was what she was doing, and there was no reason to stop. His footsteps crossed the room. She heard him at the reading table, the sound of papers, a chair being drawn out. He sat. Silence. She continued along the shelf. She was almost at the end of it when she reached the French novels, a collection, well thumbed, arranged by author. She had read most of them. She did not think about this, or tried not to, and reached for the first one to check its position. "Can you read French, Mrs. Ashby?" She turned. He was at the table with papers before him, but his attention on her, and there was something in the question that was not entirely casual, a quality of deliberateness to it, as though he had been waiting to ask it and had decided now was the time. "A little, Your Grace," she said. He reached across the table and picked up a volume that had been sitting there. She had not noticed it, or had noticed it and not allowed herself to notice it, which was a different thing. He opened it, found a page, and read a line in French. His accent was good, better than she expected, and the line was from a novel she had read twice, once at 17 and once at 21, and the meaning of it was different each time. She felt her eyes move to the page. She felt them track the line he had read. She felt her mouth begin, very slightly, to form the shape of the words. She stopped herself, but not quite in time. He looked up. The silence was long enough to have a texture. "A little," he said, not unkindly, not mockingly, simply observing, the way he observed most things, with that steady, unhurried quality that she was finding, progressively and inconveniently, very difficult to be in the same room with. "I picked some up," she said. "Over the years." He looked at her for a moment longer. "It's a good novel," he said. "If you'd like to borrow it." She looked at the book in his hands, at the worn spine of it, the pages soft with reading. "Thank you," she said. Perhaps. She went back to the shelves. She did not take the book. She knew she would not take the book, because taking the book was the kind of thing that made distance smaller, and smaller distance was exactly what she could not afford. But that evening, in her small, clean room with the kitchen garden outside the window, she found herself thinking about the line he had read, turning it over, hearing it in his voice. She had known when she came here that this would be hard. She had not entirely known what kind of hard. She heard his name before she saw him. It came through the study door on a Wednesday morning, Mr. Graves, inside with the Duke, going through the week's appointments in the methodical way they did every Wednesday. Vivienne was in the corridor, not listening, passing through on her way to the linen cupboard, when the name stopped her feet without consulting her. Lawton. Mr. Edward Lawton. Thursday afternoon, 2 o'clock. Matter of business. She stood in the corridor for 3 seconds. Then she continued to the linen cupboard, counted the tablecloths that did not need counting, and stood very still in the smell of clean linen and lavender water until her breathing was even again. Edward. She had not seen him since the morning he left. He had not come to say goodbye. He had sent a letter, which was worse. 3 paragraphs of careful language that said everything except "I am leaving because you have nothing now," and meant nothing except that. She had read it twice, folded it, put it in the fireplace, and watched it burn with the focused attention of someone committing a thing to memory by destroying it. She had told herself she was not heartbroken. She had been wrong. She had been heartbroken in the particular way of someone who discovers that the thing they mourned was not what they thought it was, not the person, not exactly, but the version of themselves that had believed in the person. That Vivienne, the certain one, the one who had walked through summer afternoons knowing exactly what she wanted and exactly where she was going, had burned with the letter, and what had risen in her place was quieter and considerably more durable. She had not, she realized, thought about Edward in 3 weeks. She noticed this now in the linen cupboard and filed it without examination. Thursday came the way Thursdays did, without sympathy. She had prepared for it in the only way available to her, which was to be very busy. She had reorganized the silver cupboard, which had not needed reorganizing. She had reviewed the week's menus with the cook, which had not needed reviewing. She had found 7 separate tasks that required her presence in rooms that were not the entrance hall, the study, or anywhere else a visitor arriving at 2 o'clock might reasonably appear. She was in the kitchen at 2:05, going over the household accounts when she heard the carriage. She did not look up from the accounts. She heard the entrance hall, the door, the footsteps, Mr. Graves's measured greeting, a voice responding. That voice. She had not forgotten it, which she supposed was inevitable, and she had not expected to forget it. But there was a difference between knowing a thing abstractly and hearing it come through two closed doors and into your body like a key turning in a lock you had thought rusted shut. She looked at the numbers in the ledger before her. She counted to 10. Then she went back to work. She saw him at 4 o'clock. The meeting with the Duke had apparently gone long. She gathered this from Harris, who gathered most things and distributed them with the efficiency of a man who understood that information was its own form of currency. The men had moved from the study to the drawing room and were taking tea, and Vivienne had sent Dot up with the tray, and that should have been sufficient. That should have kept her in the kitchen for another hour at least. But there was the matter of the cream, which Dot had forgotten in the way that Dot forgot things, completely, cheerfully, without apparent awareness that forgetting was something other than a neutral act. And Vivienne was the one who discovered it, and Mrs. Peel was watching from the corridor, with an expression that suggested she would remember the outcome of whatever happened next. Vivienne took the cream upstairs. She had a moment outside the drawing room door. She used it. Then she knocked, entered, crossed to the tea table with the decorum of a woman who was precisely what she appeared to be and nothing more, set the cream down and turned to go. Mrs. Ashby, the Duke's voice. She turned. He was in the chair nearest the fire, and Edward was across from him, and both of them were looking at her. The Duke with his usual steady attention and Edward with something that started as surprise and moved through several expressions in rapid succession before settling, after the briefest of pauses, into nothing. Into the deliberate, performative blankness of a man deciding not to know someone. Vivienne looked at the Duke. My apologies for the interruption, Your Grace. The cream was inadvertently left below. Thank you, he said. He glanced toward Edward with the mild courtesy of a host making an introduction. Mrs. Ashby is our housekeeper. Excellent manager, best we've had, Graves tells me. Edward looked at her. She looked at him. 2 years. He was unchanged, the same easy handsomeness, the same quality of taking up exactly the right amount of space in a room, the same eyes that had once looked at her as though she were the most interesting thing in his world. They looked at her now with nothing in them. A locked door. A wall with no gate. How do you do, he said, in the polite, featureless tone of a man speaking to a housekeeper. Very well, thank you, sir, she said in the polite, featureless tone of a housekeeper being spoken to. She left the room. She did not stop walking until she reached the end of the east corridor, where the linen cupboard was, where she had stood 2 days ago counting tablecloths. She went inside. She closed the door. She stood in the smell of clean linen and lavender water, and put the back of her hand against her mouth, and did something she had not done in 8 months. She allowed herself, for 30 seconds, to feel the full weight of it. Not Edward, or not only Edward. The whole accumulated architecture of the last 2 years. Her father's face at the breakfast table. The letter from the bank. The morning she stood in her mother's bedroom and understood that the jewels would need to be sold, that the house would need to be vacated, that everything she had understood herself to stand on had simply ceased. And then Edward's letter, 3 careful paragraphs, and then nothing. And then here, this house, this corridor, this cupboard, standing in the dark counting tablecloths because it was the only thing she could do that felt like ground. 30 seconds. Then she straightened, breathed, put her hands flat against her thighs and pressed until she could feel them, solid, present, real. She went back to work. Dinner that evening was a trial of a particular kind. Edward stayed, she had known he would. The invitation had been extended. She had seen the amended place setting when she reviewed the table. One additional cover. She had moved the arrangement with her own hands, making room where there had been sufficient room already. The way you made room for things you did not want but could not refuse. She was in and out of the dining room throughout the meal. Edward sat to the Duke's right. He talked with the ease of a man entirely comfortable in his surroundings, told a story about a hunting trip that had apparently gone wrong in several entertaining ways, made the Duke laugh, not the real one. She had learned to distinguish them by now, but the social one, genuine enough without being unguarded. He admired the wine. He complimented the food. He did not look at Vivienne. Not once across the entire length of the meal. She moved around the table 3 times, and he did not turn his head in her direction, did not register her approach, did not give any physical indication that he was aware of her presence in the room. She found, to her own considerable surprise, that this was worse than the blankness in the drawing room. At least the blankness had required a decision. This required nothing, or appeared to require nothing. She had simply ceased to exist. Downgraded past acknowledgement, past even the minimal performance of not knowing someone, into a category of person to whom one did not need to apply any conscious effort at all. She refilled the water glass at his elbow. He did not glance at her hand. She moved on. She heard them afterward. Not deliberately. She was in the passage outside the dining room, waiting for Harris to bring the next course through, when the voices came clearly through the door that had not been quite fully closed. Edward's voice, low, amused. Interesting choice of housekeeper, Ashby. She has good bearing. A pause, then something she couldn't catch from the Duke. Edward again. Some women land on their feet, I suppose. Remarkable, really, when you consider the Duke's voice, cutting across cleanly, with a quality she had not heard from him before, not angry, something colder than angry. She does her job well. That is what matters in this house, silence. Then the conversation moved on, and Harris came through the service door with the next course, and Vivienne stepped back to make room, and that was all. She stood in the narrow passage and thought. Some women land on their feet. She thought about what it meant, that sentence in that mouth, in that voice. She thought about the morning he left. The 3 paragraphs. The fireplace. She thought, yes. Some do. He left the next morning. She was in the entrance hall when he came down with his bag, unavoidably, in the way that things in small spaces were sometimes unavoidable. Harris was bringing the carriage round. Mr. Graves was occupied. There was simply Vivienne and Edward, and 6 feet of entrance hall between them. He stopped when he saw her. For a moment, just a moment, something moved across his face. Not guilt exactly. Not apology. Something more like a man seeing a sum that doesn't add up and trying to resolve it through an expression, rather than thought. Mrs. Ashby, he said. She met his eyes. Mr. Lawton, a pause. He seemed to be deciding whether to say something. She waited, with the patience of someone who had learned that waiting was almost always more powerful than speaking. I always wondered, he said finally, with a smile that was almost the old one, almost easy, almost warm, almost convincing. What became of you? After everything, she looked at him. She thought about the 3 paragraphs. She thought about 30 seconds in a linen cupboard. She thought about a woman standing in her mother's bedroom, understanding that the floor was gone. "I imagine you did," she said. The smile didn't quite know what to do with that. It stayed a moment too long and then faded unevenly, like a fire going out in patches. "I suppose this is," he started. "The carriage is ready, Mr. Lawton," she said. "I hope you have a pleasant journey." She stepped aside. He went. She stood in the entrance hall and listened to the carriage pull away and did not watch it go, because watching it go would have required something from her she was not willing to give. Harris appeared at the door, looked at her, looked at the drive. "Shall I close up, Mrs. Ashby, please?" she said. He closed the door. She was in the study that afternoon. The Duke had requested the household accounts. She was bringing them, when he stopped her before she could set them down and leave. "Mrs. Ashby," she straightened. "Your Grace." He was at the window, not at his desk, looking out at the grounds with his hands behind his back, the posture of a man who had been thinking and had arrived somewhere. "Mr. Lawton," he said without preamble, "made several remarks during his visit that I found distasteful." He did not turn from the window. "If he caused you any discomfort, I want you to tell me." She stood with the ledger in her hands and looked at his back. "He did not, Your Grace," she said. A pause. He turned then and looked at her with the attention that she was finding, progressively and irreversibly, very difficult to receive without feeling it somewhere she did not intend to feel things. "I see," he said. He held her gaze. "I will tell you plainly that I do not intend to invite him again. There are men whose company improves a house, and men whose company does not. He falls firmly in the latter." Vivienne said nothing. "You deserve to be spoken of with respect," he said. "In this house, that is not optional. For anyone on my staff." She looked at him. She thought, he doesn't know. He has no idea. He is saying this to a housekeeper, out of basic decency. And he has no idea that the woman he is being decent to once stood in a garden and told him no, and is now standing in his study holding his household accounts and trying very hard not to feel anything at all. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said. Her voice was even. She was proud of it. He nodded, looked at her a moment longer, and turned back to the window. She set the accounts on the desk. She left the room. She made it to the end of the corridor, and around the corner, and into the stairwell that led to the upper floors before she stopped. She put her back against the wall and looked at the ceiling. Something had broken quietly, somewhere inside her, in the region of her chest. Not dramatically, not in the way of things that had broken before, the big visible collapses. This was smaller. This was the sound of something that had been held together with considerable effort and very little material finally, in the face of one too many kindnesses, giving way. She pressed her lips together. She breathed. She thought, 2 years ago I stood in his garden and felt nothing but certainty. I was so certain. I was so sure I knew exactly what I wanted and exactly what I was doing. She thought I was wrong about so many things. She stood in the stairwell for a long time. Then she went upstairs, sat on the edge of her bed, and for the first time in 8 months she cried quietly, entirely alone, with the kitchen garden outside the window and the house settling around her and no one to see. It lasted exactly as long as it needed to. Then it was done, and she washed her face and went back to work. It began with a name in a ledger. Not her name, or not directly. It was a supplier's account, old from 3 years prior, a wine merchant in Derby whose records Mr. Graves had kept with the thoroughness he applied to everything. The Duke had asked for a full accounting of the household expenditure going back 5 years, a routine review, the kind of thing an estate required periodically, and Graves had brought the ledgers, and the Duke had been working through them on a Tuesday evening when he came across an entry that made him pause. Hartwell House, November 1855. 2 cases claret, 1 case port. A delivery address. Local. A family he knew of not well, not personally, but the way you knew families in a county, by name and reputation, and the occasional crossing of paths at assemblies and dinners, and the particular social geography of English country life. He had known a girl from that family. Briefly. 2 years ago, a summer that he had spent largely not thinking about, and had succeeded in not thinking about with only partial success. He sat with the ledger open and looked at the entry, and did not think about anything for a moment. Then he turned the page. He did not do anything with the thought immediately. This was characteristic of him. He was not a man who acted on incomplete information, who moved before he had looked at a thing from all its angles. He had learned this about himself early, and had, over the years, refined it into something that served him. He put the ledger away. He went about his week. He managed his estate, his correspondence, the quiet machinery of a life that was orderly and functional and, if not precisely happy, then at least not unhappy in any way he couldn't account for. He watched Vivienne Ashby do her job. He had been watching her do her job for 3 weeks, and he understood, as he looked back over those 3 weeks with the benefit of a question he hadn't previously known to ask, that he had been noticing things and filing them away without knowing what he was filing them for. The way she moved through the house with the ease of someone who had memorized it. The French, the silver, the particular way she arranged flowers in the entrance hall, a specific style, an instinctive preference for certain combinations, the kind of thing you didn't learn from experience but absorbed, over years, from a home that cared about such things. The way she had looked at the dining room table the first time she reviewed it, not examining it but recognizing it. A difference visible only in the eyes. He thought about the name in the ledger. He thought about Edward Lawton, sitting in his drawing room saying some women land on their feet. He thought about the expression on Vivienne's face when she had brought the cream, the containment of it, the precise and effortful neutrality of a woman managing something very large in a very small space. On Wednesday evening, he went to find Mr. Graves. Graves knew. This was clear within the first 30 seconds of the conversation, not from anything he said, but from the way he received the question. The slight pause. The adjustment of his expression from neutral to more neutral, which in a man of Graves's training was itself a tell. The Duke looked at him. "How long?" he said. Graves was quiet for a moment. "Then, I had my suspicions from the first week, Your Grace." The way she knew the house. The French. Several other things, a pause. "I confirmed it approximately 10 days ago, through the registry in Derby. The name Ashby is her mother's maiden name. The Duke absorbed this. And you said nothing. It was not my information to share." Graves met his gaze steadily, with the dignity of a man who had made a decision he stood behind. "She came here with a legitimate letter of reference and legitimate qualifications for the position. What she chose to disclose beyond that was her own affair." A pause. "And she is, Your Grace, if I may say so, the best housekeeper this house has had in 20 years. That is not irrelevant." The Duke looked at the window. Looked back. "No," he said. "It isn't." He left Graves's sitting room and went to the library and stood at the window for a long time, looking out at the dark grounds, and thought about a Tuesday afternoon in June, 2 years ago, and a woman in a garden telling him, politely and firmly and with complete certainty, that she could not accept his offer. He thought about walking home afterward, the particular quality of that walk, the June afternoon, the decision to feel nothing, the discovery that feeling nothing was an active effort and not a passive state. He thought about Edward Lawton. He thought about some women land on their feet. He thought about Vivian Ashby standing in his dining room, refilling a water glass, while the man who had left her discussed her landing on her feet to the man who had once wanted to marry her. He stood at the window for a very long time. He waited a week. He was not entirely sure why, perhaps because he needed the week to understand what he was going to do with what he knew, or perhaps because he needed the week to understand what he felt about it, which was a more complicated question, and one he was less practiced at answering. What he felt, he determined by the end of the week, was this: he was angry on her behalf. Not loudly, he was not a loud man, but with a deep, steady heat that had been building since Lawton's visit and had not abated. The image of her at that table, managing her face, managing her hands, managing the entire enormous complicated weight of that situation with a composure he now understood had cost her considerably, and doing it while Lawton spoke about her as though she were a mildly interesting footnote to his own story. He was also, and this he identified last and looked at carefully from several angles before admitting it, something he had thought he had filed away so thoroughly it was no longer retrievable. He was still affected by her. He sat with this knowledge in the library on a Thursday evening and found it less surprising than he might have expected. He had not thought about Vivienne Hartwell with any consistency in 2 years. He had been thorough about not thinking about her. But consistency and thoroughness were different from completion, and he understood now, looking at it directly, that what he had filed away had not dissolved. It had simply waited, in the patient way of things that had nowhere else to go. He called for her on Friday morning. She came to the study at 10 o'clock. She was composed. She was always composed. This was something he had noted from the beginning and was only now understanding the full architecture of. She came in with the particular stillness of someone who had heard something in the summons that required preparation and had prepared. He was at his desk. He did not stand, because standing would have changed the quality of what he was about to say in a way he hadn't decided on yet. "Sit down, Mrs. Ashby," he said. A brief pause, just barely perceptible. Then she sat. He looked at her. She looked at him. The morning light from the east window came between them, neutral and unhelpful. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to answer honestly, even if the honest answer is difficult." She held his gaze. "Waiting. Why didn't you tell me?" The question sat between them. Her eyes moved not away, just a slight shift, a fractional adjustment, the look of a person calculating. Then they came back to his. "It wasn't relevant, Your Grace," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Not relevant? No, you turned down my proposal," he said. "And then came to work in my house." And said nothing. She said nothing now either. But her hands, folded in her lap, pressed together slightly. He noticed this. "Would you have hired me," she said carefully, "if you had known?" He considered the question honestly, which was the only way he knew how to consider things. "No," he said. "Probably not." She nodded, a small, contained movement. "Then it was relevant only to me." He looked at her. At the composed face, the still hands, the woman who had spent 3 weeks moving through his house, carrying a secret that most people would have found unbearable. "The man," he said. "Lawton." He left when your family lost everything, not a question. She received it as such. The silence lasted long enough to be an answer. I see, he said. He heard his own voice, flat, deliberate. The voice he used when something was larger than he wanted it to be, and he was managing the size of it. And before that, before everything, he was the reason you said no. Another silence. Yes, she said. Barely audible. But honest. He looked at the desk, at the papers on it which he was not seeing. He thought about June. About the roses. About I understand, said to a woman who had loved someone else, who had been certain about it, who had walked away in the summer afternoon and left him standing in his own garden with the particular empty feeling of a door closed on a room you had wanted to enter. He thought about Lawton in his drawing room. He thought about some women land on their feet. Look at me, he said. She looked at him. I am going to ask you something else, he said. And I want the same honesty. She waited. Are you all right? The question landed differently than the others had. He saw it land, saw the slight change in her face, the almost imperceptible shift of something that had been held at a certain tension beginning, for just a moment, to release. Yes, she said. That, he said quietly, is the first thing you have said to me in this conversation that I don't believe. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, I am managing. Yes, he said. I know. I have been watching you manage for 3 weeks. He paused. You are exceptionally good at it. Something moved across her face, not quite a smile, the shadow of something that, on a different day in different circumstances, might have been one. Thank you, she said. He stood then. Moved to the window, because he needed to move, because sitting still at the desk felt suddenly like the wrong posture for what he was saying. Your position here is not in question, he said, looking out at the grounds. I want that to be absolutely clear. Whatever the circumstances of how you came here, you are good at this work, and this house is better for your being in it. He paused. But I want you to know that I know. Because I am not willing to have you managing something this large entirely alone in my house. He heard her breathe. That is very kind, Your Grace, she said. It is not kindness, he said. He turned from the window. It is, I'm not sure what it is, entirely. But it is not only kindness. The room was very quiet. She looked at him with an expression he could not fully read, something careful, and underneath the carefulness, something he recognized, or thought he recognized, with the uncertain caution of a man who had been wrong about things before and did not intend to be wrong about this. I should return to my duties, she said. Yes, he said. She stood, moved toward the door. Mrs. Ashby, she stopped. Vivienne, he had not planned to say her name. It arrived without consultation, the way certain true things did, and having said it he could not unsay it and did not particularly wish to. She stood with her back to him. I should not have accepted it so quietly, he said. 2 years ago. I should not have said I understand and walked away. A pause. I understood nothing. I was simply being dignified about not understanding. A long silence. You couldn't have known, she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. Neither of us could have known anything. No, he agreed. But I am telling you now so that you know. He paused. Whatever happens next, whatever you decide, I want you to know that. She stood in the doorway for a moment that seemed to last considerably longer than it was. Then she said quietly without turning around, Thank you, she left. He stood in the study and listened to her footsteps go down the corridor, steady, unhurried, the footstep of a woman who was managing, and felt something he had been careful not to feel for 2 years settle in his chest with the quiet, inconvenient permanence of something that had decided it was staying. That evening, Vivienne sat on the edge of her bed in her small, clean room. She did not cry. She had used her crying for the week, and she was not profligate about it. She sat and held her mother's pearl earrings in her palm, cool and smooth, the weight of them familiar, and thought about the study and the morning light in Vivienne, said without planning, landing without warning, doing something to the careful architecture of her composure that she was not going to examine too closely tonight. She thought about I should not have accepted it so quietly. She thought about June, about the garden, about the certainty she had felt, that bright, complete, terrible certainty that had turned out to be made of something much less solid than she had believed. She thought I was so sure I knew what I wanted. She thought I was not sure about the right things. Outside the window, the kitchen garden was dark and still. Somewhere in the house, a clock struck 9. The house settled around her with the familiar sounds of it, the third stair, the draft under the library door, the particular creak of the east wing corridor that she had learned to move through without thinking. Her house. Not her house. The house she had learned the way you learned a place you had once thought might be yours, and had then found yourself in again, through a door you had not anticipated, on terms you had not chosen. She closed her fingers around the earrings. She thought about tomorrow, about the day after, about the careful management of whatever was building between them, whether to manage it, whether managing it was still possible, whether she had the architecture left to do it after an afternoon in a sunlit study, and a name said without planning that had taken something apart in her she was not sure she could reassemble. She put the earrings away. She lay down. She looked at the ceiling. I should not have accepted it so quietly. Neither, she thought, in the dark, with the house around her, and the kitchen garden outside and everything uncertain and nothing resolved, should I. The gossip arrived on a Thursday. It came in the form of Lady Henrietta Mowbray, a woman of 55, considerable social influence, and the particular talent of someone who had spent 3 decades distributing information under the guise of concern. She arrived for tea with the Duke as she occasionally did, with the ease of a woman who considered herself above the requirement of advance notice, and she brought it with her the way people like her always brought things, lightly, casually, as though it were barely worth mentioning. Vivienne was not in the room when it was said. She learned of it from Dot, who had heard it from Harris, who had been at the sideboard when Lady Mowbray settled into the chair by the fire, accepted her tea, and said, with the smile of a woman performing generosity, I do think it's rather extraordinary, William, the situation you've found yourself in. One hears things, of course. One always hears things. And I confess when I heard that Hartwell's daughter was working in your house I thought, well, that can't be right surely. But then I thought, no, really, it is rather pathetic, isn't it? Keeping her around like a charity case. People will talk. Harris had reported the Duke's response to Graves. Graves had mentioned it to Dot in passing, by accident, without intending it to travel further. It traveled immediately. Vivienne was in the linen cupboard when Dot told her. Of course she was in the linen cupboard. It had become, in the weeks she had been here, the place she went when she needed to be somewhere that required her presence for a legitimate reason, while also being small and private and smelling of things that did not change. She had spent a considerable portion of her inner life in this cupboard. She felt she owed it something. Dot told her with the face of a child delivering news she didn't fully understand but sensed was significant. 14 years old and earnest, attached to Vivienne over the past 3 weeks with the uncomplicated devotion of someone who had decided on a person and intended to stay decided. Harris said his grace was very short with her, Dot offered, in the tone of someone providing consolation. He said he'd not heard him speak to a guest that way before. Thank you, Dot, Vivienne said. He said, that's enough, thank you, Dot went. Vivienne stood in the linen cupboard. Pathetic. The word sat in the air of the small room like something with weight. She turned it over, examined it from different angles, with the dispassionate thoroughness of a woman who had learned that looking at things directly was less dangerous than looking away. Was it pathetic? She had asked herself this before in the early weeks, in the dark of her room, in the particular honesty of very late nights. Was it pathetic what she had done? Coming here of all places. Constructing this careful fiction and maintaining it, and moving through these rooms with her managed face and her managed hands, carrying everything she carried, for a wage she once would have spent on gloves. She had decided in those late nights that it was not pathetic. That survival was not pathetic. That what she had done required more courage than anything she had done in the years before it, when courage had been easy because nothing was at stake. Lady Mowbray had not arrived at the same conclusion. Lady Mowbray, she thought, had never needed courage for anything more demanding than deciding which carriage to take to an assembly. She straightened the tablecloths that were already straight. She went back to work. She heard the Duke's voice through the drawing-room door. Not clearly, she was passing, not pausing. She was very specifically not pausing, but clearly enough. His voice, and then Lady Mowbray's, and then his again, with that quality she had heard once before on the day of Lawton's visit. Cold and flat and final, the voice of a man who had reached the end of something and was not interested in going further. Then Lady Mowbray's voice higher, recovering herself. Then silence. Vivienne continued down the corridor. Lady Mowbray left at 4 o'clock. Vivienne was in the entrance hall, unavoidably, which was becoming a pattern she was beginning to suspect was the universe expressing an opinion. Lady Mowbray swept past her with the magnificent indifference of a woman who had just lost a small battle and intended to behave as though it hadn't happened. At the door she paused. She turned, looked at Vivienne with the assessing, recalibrating look of a woman updating her files. Mrs. Ashby, she said. Lady Mowbray. A pause, that precise social calculation, the weighing of what Vivienne was now against what she had been and what she might become, the rapid arithmetic of consequence and positioning. Then Lady Mowbray said, with the air of someone making a tactical concession, "You have his confidence, it seems. I do my job well, my lady." That is all. Another pause. Lady Mowbray's eyes moved over her face, looking for something. A crack, a concession, some acknowledgement of the power that had just been demonstrated and the precariousness of the position it had been demonstrated from. She did not find what she was looking for. "Yes," she said finally. Well, she left. Harris closed the door. Vivienne stood in the entrance hall and felt the particular unstable aftermath of something that had been a near miss, the shakiness of a thing avoided, the awareness that the avoiding was not the same as the resolving. People would talk. They were already talking. Lady Mowbray was a beginning, not an end, the first stone in what would become, if it continued, an avalanche. The county was not large and social memory was not short, and a duke defending his housekeeper against Lady Henrietta Mowbray would be discussed over dinner tables from here to Buxton by Saturday. Vivienne understood, standing in the entrance hall, what this meant. She had understood it, if she was honest, since the morning in the study. Since Vivienne said without planning. Since I should not have accepted it so quietly. She had understood what was building and she had managed it, because managing things was what she did, because it was the only tool she had that she trusted entirely. But there were things that management could not hold indefinitely. She thought about the Duke defending her to Lady Mowbray. She thought about the cold, flat quality of his voice. She thought about what it would cost him, not now, not this week, but slowly, cumulatively, in the way that things attached themselves to a man's name and stayed there. A housekeeper who had once turned him down. A household full of someone else's embarrassment. A story that, however it was told, had no version that didn't make him look foolish or worse. She thought, he has been kind to me. He has been kinder than I deserved and kinder than I expected and kinder, certainly, than I was to him in a garden 2 years ago. She thought, I will not let his kindness become his liability. She wrote the letter that night. She kept it short, kept it formal, said in the measured language of someone who had made a decision, and was not interested in argument that she believed her continued presence created difficulty for the household, that she was grateful for the position, that she wished the house well. She wrote it at the small desk in her room by candlelight, with the kitchen garden dark outside the window and the house quiet around her, and she did not allow herself to feel anything while she was writing it because feeling things while writing it would have made it impossible to finish. She finished it. She read it over once. She sealed it. She went downstairs in her nightgown in the dark, with a candle, and placed it on the center of the Duke's desk where he would find it in the morning, and went back to bed. She did not sleep. She lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought, with the thorough, unflinching honesty she applied to things when there was no one watching, is this right? She turned it over, examined it, approached it from every angle she could find. Yes, it was right. It was the right thing, and she was doing it, and it was going to cost her a great deal, in ways she was not going to enumerate in the dark, because enumerating them would not help. And that was the price of doing the right thing, and she had always known that the right thing had a price, and she was willing to pay it. She stared at the ceiling. She thought about the library, the French novel. A little said back to her, with something behind it that she hadn't let herself look at directly. She thought about Vivienne. She thought about the garden. June. The roses. A man saying I understand with a face she hadn't looked at carefully enough, because she had been so certain, so full of her own direction, that she hadn't thought to look. She thought I looked away from too many things. I was so sure I knew what I was looking at that I didn't look. She looked at the ceiling until the dark outside the window began, very gradually, to be less dark. Then she got up, dressed, and began to pack her bag. She was nearly done when the knock came. Not at the front door, at her door. A single knock, firm, without hesitation, the knock of a man who had made a decision. She stood in the middle of the room with her half-packed bag on the bed. She opened the door. He was in the corridor. No jacket, she had noticed he did this when he was thinking, left the jacket somewhere in the process of deciding something and didn't retrieve it, and his hair was slightly disordered, and he had the look of a man who had come directly from his desk without stopping. He looked at her, at the bag on the bed behind her. "You're leaving," he said. "Yes, Your Grace." He looked at the bag for a moment longer. Then he came in without asking, without waiting, stepping through the doorway of her small room as though the protocol of it had not occurred to him, which she suspected was true. He stood in the middle of the room and looked at the bag and then at her, and she could see him, for the first time perhaps since she had known him, not entirely managing himself. Not falling apart. Just present, without the careful architecture fully in place, the way a house looked at dawn before everyone had arranged themselves. "I did not accept your resignation," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Your Grace, it isn't appropriate for me to. I know what is appropriate," he said without heat. "I have known what is appropriate for 36 years. It has cost me a great deal." He paused. "More than I fully accounted for." She held his gaze. Lady Mowbray," he said, with a precision that settled the question entirely, "has never once in her life done anything that I have found worth the inconvenience of caring about. She is not going to start now." "It isn't only Lady Mowbray," Vivienne said. "You know that. It will be others. It will be an accumulation. And your name, my name," he said, "can withstand considerably more than the opinion of people who have nothing better to do than discuss the composition of my household staff." He paused. "And I am not asking you to remain as my household staff." The room went very quiet. Vivienne looked at him. "James," she stopped. His name, said without planning, arrived in the room and stayed there, and she watched him receive it, watched the slight change in his face, the almost imperceptible thing that happened behind his eyes when she said it. "I have spent 3 weeks," he said, "watching you manage this house with more grace than it deserves and more courage than you've been given credit for by anyone." He moved, not toward her, not yet, but away from the center of the room to the window, where he stood with his hands at his sides and looked out at the early morning kitchen garden, gray and still. "I have spent 2 years telling myself that what happened in the garden was concluded. Filed. Done." A pause. "I was wrong." She stood by the bed with her half-packed bag and the pearl earrings at the bottom of it and listened to him. "I am not asking you to stay because of what I feel," he said. "I am not going to use what I feel as a pressure. You came here in difficult circumstances, and you have managed those circumstances with more dignity than most people would have managed, and the last thing I am going to do is add to your difficulties." He turned from the window. "I am asking because Graves tells me you are the best housekeeper this house has had in 20 years, which is entirely irrelevant but also entirely true. And because Mrs. Peel will run this household into the ground within a fortnight if you leave, which is slightly more relevant." Vivienne looked at him. Something loosened in her chest. Very slightly. Just enough to make her eyes uncertain. "And," he said more quietly, "because I am not a man who says things he does not mean, and I said something to you yesterday that I meant, and I would like the opportunity to say more of it. In time. Without pressure. Without," he paused, and she saw him, carefully and deliberately, put aside the last of the management. "Without you in the east wing of my house polishing silver and calling me your Grace when we both know the geography of this situation rather better than that." Vivienne stood very still. She thought about the letter on his desk. The careful formal language. Grateful for the position. Wish the house well. She thought about the garden, and Edward, and the floor going out, and 8 months of being very small in other people's spaces. She thought about Dot leaving biscuits without comment. About Harris with his cautious professional approval. About Graves, who had known and said nothing because it wasn't his information to share. She thought about a library and a French novel and a little, said back to her, and the real smile, the one she had catalogued without letting herself name why she was cataloguing it. She thought, "I have been so careful. I have been so very careful for so very long. You should know," she said, because she was going to be honest even now, even here, especially here, "that I am quite poor." Something happened in his face. A shift, and then, slowly, the thing she had catalogued and not named, arriving, full and unmanaged and unmistakable. "I know exactly what you are," he said. "I have known since the garden." She looked at him. He looked at her. The morning light was coming through the window of her small, clean room, the same light that came through the south-facing windows in the afternoon, that she had known before she came here, that she had known because she had stood in this house before on a different side of everything and watched it move. "I'll unpack," she said. He let out a breath, quiet, barely audible, the breath of a man setting something down. He looked at the bag. At her. At the bag again. "The silver," he said after a moment with the careful neutrality of a man finding his footing, "needs doing before Friday." "I know," she said. "I was going to do it Thursday." "Good," he said. He went to the door. Stopped. Turned back, and there it was, the real one, arriving in her small room in the early morning light, unhurried and unmanaged and entirely, simply his. "Vivienne," he said. "James," she said. He left. She stood in the room with the half-packed bag on the bed, and the kitchen garden outside the window, and her heart doing something she hadn't felt in a long time, something inconvenient and warm, and entirely beyond the reach of management. She began to unpack. 6 weeks later, on a bright February morning with frost still hard on the ground and a fire in every room, James Ashford, Duke of Elmsworth, asked Vivienne Hartwell to marry him. He did it in the library. This was not accidental. He had the French novel on the table, placed there deliberately, with the awareness that he was being somewhat obvious about it, and the decision that being obvious was, in this instance, entirely intentional. He had things prepared to say, and he said them, and some of them came out as he had planned, and some of them didn't. And in between the planned things and the unplanned things, there was a moment where she looked at him with an expression he had never quite seen on her face before. Open. Unmanaged. Simply entirely there. He stopped talking. She said yes. The roses came back in June. They always did. The East Wall roses were old and established, and had no interest in anyone's feelings about them, blooming reliably every June regardless of what was happening inside the house. But this June, Vivienne stood at the library window and watched them open, one by one, along the warm stone, and felt the particular quality of a thing returning that had once meant something else and now meant something better. June. The roses. The light through the trees. The last time she had stood in this county in June and looked at roses, she had been someone entirely different, or not different exactly. The same person, but without the parts that mattered most. The parts that had been added since, at considerable cost, and in ways she had not anticipated, were the parts she would not give back for anything. She turned from the window. The library was hers now. Or she was the library's. She had not yet decided which framing was more accurate, and she suspected the distinction was irrelevant. What mattered was that she was in it, in a house that was hers, on a morning in June, with the roses on the east wall and a fire she had not needed to lay herself, and the French novel on the table where James had left it last night, open to a page she had already read and would read again. She sat down. She picked up the novel. She read it without any pretense whatsoever of knowing only a little. The wedding had been in March, small, deliberate, in the village church, with the frost still on the ground and snowdrops in the churchyard that Dot had apparently inspected at length on the way in and declared satisfactory. Mr. Graves had attended with the expression of a man whose long-term investment had finally matured, and Harris had cried, which he had denied immediately and continued to deny in the face of considerable evidence. The county had predictably talked. It had talked for approximately 6 weeks, at the end of which it had arrived, as counties eventually did, at the conclusion that the Duke of Elmsworth had married a woman of good family, whatever the intervening circumstances, and that the intervening circumstances were, on reflection, not as interesting as they had initially appeared because the marriage itself was so clearly, so straightforwardly, so unmistakably, the right thing that there was nothing left to say about it that didn't reflect well on both parties. Lady Mowbray had sent a gift, a silver tea service, extravagant and slightly defensive. Vivienne had written a thank-you note of perfect warmth and perfect correctness, and placed the tea service in the good cabinet where it would be brought out for exactly the visits it was designed to impress, and not one occasion more. Lady Forsyth had written a private letter, separate from the formal congratulations, that said, "I am very glad. I thought you remarkable before. I think you more so now." Vivienne had kept this letter in the left-hand drawer of the library desk, where she put the things that mattered. Mr. Graves had retired in April. He had been considering it for 2 years, he told them, and had stayed partly from habit and partly from a reluctance to leave before things were, as he put it, settled. When they were settled, he went, with the quiet dignity of a man who had done his work and knew it. Harris was head of household now, accepting this promotion with the solemnity of someone undertaking a sacred obligation, and not once letting them down in the 3 months since. Dot had been promoted to parlor maid, and had told Vivienne, very seriously, that she intended to be the best parlor maid in Derbyshire. Vivienne had told her, equally seriously, that she did not doubt it for a moment. Mrs. Peel had left in February, managed carefully, with generosity and no drama, in the way Vivienne managed all things, quietly and directly, with the minimum of fuss and the maximum of care for everyone's dignity. She had departed without incident and without warmth, and Vivienne had wished her well and meant it, because spending energy on not meaning it was a waste of a resource she had learned to value. Copernicus had arrived in May. He had appeared at the kitchen door on a Tuesday morning, an enormous, imperious orange cat of completely unknown provenance, who had surveyed the kitchen with the air of someone conducting an inspection and finding it marginally acceptable. Dot had given him a piece of kipper. He had eaten it without acknowledgement, and then settled himself on the window seat as though he had decided, and the decision was not up for discussion. James had looked at him on the first evening and said, "Is that our cat?" "Apparently," Vivienne had said. "Does he have a name?" Dot calls him Copernicus. James had looked at the cat. The cat had looked at James, with the expression of a creature who was prepared to tolerate a great deal in exchange for reasonable kipper access. "All right," James had said, and that had been the end of it. Copernicus now occupied the window seat in the library, with the settled authority of someone who had made his position clear, and saw no need to revisit it. The house was different now, in the way that houses were different when they were properly inhabited. Not loud, it was not a loud house, and neither of them was a loud person, and the staff were professional and the rooms were orderly. But there was a quality to the air that Vivienne had noticed gradually over the months of spring, in the way you notice things that changed slowly, a warmth that wasn't only the fires, a fullness that wasn't only the rooms being used. She had tried to describe this to James one evening, and he had looked at her for a moment and said, "It was waiting." For what? For there to be something worth waiting for. She had looked at him and felt the particular warmth of a thing that was simply, entirely true. Edward Lawton came to Derby in May. She heard of it second-hand, a business matter, a meeting with someone connected to the estate by 3 degrees of association. She did not see him. She did not seek him out, and he did not seek her, and the whole of it passed at a distance, like weather observed through a window. James mentioned it once briefly, with the careful neutrality of a man offering information, and leaving the response entirely to the person receiving it. "I know," she said. "Are you?" "Yes," she said. "Entirely," he looked at her. "Entirely," she repeated and meant it, and he understood that she meant it, and they did not speak of it again. She had thought in the months since the wedding about what she felt regarding Edward Lawton, about whether she would find, underneath the 2 years of accumulated consequence, something remaining. Some remnant. She had found nothing. Not bitterness, she had worked at that, carefully and deliberately, because bitterness was a thing that lived in you rather than in the person who had caused it, and she had no intention of housing it indefinitely. Not longing. Not even, particularly, anger. The anger had been real and had been felt, and had done what anger did when you felt it honestly, which was to burn itself down to ash and leave something cleaner in its place. What she found when she looked was simply nothing. The door was closed. The room was empty. She thought about the woman in that garden, so certain, so full of her own direction, looking at Edward Lawton and thinking she knew exactly what she was looking at. She thought she was very young. She thought this without cruelty. The woman in the garden had been doing the best she could with what she could see, and what she could see had been limited, and the limitation was simply what it was, not a failure, just the ordinary short-sightedness of someone who hadn't yet been asked to look far enough. She had been asked since. She had looked. She had found things she hadn't expected to find, in directions she hadn't known to look. She found she was glad of it. She was in the garden on a morning in late June when James found her. The roses were fully open now, pink and cream, and a deep red that tipped toward crimson in the full light. She had been walking along the wall with no particular purpose, touching the petals occasionally, thinking about nothing specific, which was something she had recently discovered she was allowed to do and was still learning the shape of. He came from the direction of the house with papers in one hand. He usually had papers in one hand, but he wasn't looking at them. He was looking at her, with the real smile, the one she had catalogued so carefully and named so late, arriving in the morning light between them. "You've been out here for an hour," he said. "Have I?" Harris was concerned. "He sent me." Harris was not concerned, she said. "Harris sent you because he knew you wanted an excuse." He looked at her with the expression of a man caught in a truth he has no particular desire to deny. "The roses are good this year," he said. "They're good every year," she said. "They don't require our opinion." "No," he agreed. He came to stand beside her, looking at the wall. "But it's pleasant to have one anyway." She looked at the roses, at the stone wall behind them warm in the sun, at the grounds rolling away in the middle distance, the same ground she had looked at from a carriage window on a November afternoon, and told herself she was viewing for the first time. She had not been viewing them for the first time. She had been coming back to them. She simply hadn't known it yet. "James," she said. "Vivienne, I owe you an apology," she said. "A proper one. Not the ones I've made before, which were partial. This one is full." He turned to look at her. She looked at the roses. "In the garden. 2 years ago. I was certain. I was so completely certain that I knew what I wanted and where I was going, and what everything meant. And the certainty made me careless. Not cruel, I hope, but careless. I didn't look at you carefully enough. I didn't look at what I was saying no to carefully enough." She paused. "I looked away from the right thing because I was too sure I was already looking at it." She turned to him. "I am sorry for that." Fully. Without qualification, he looked at her for a moment. "You couldn't have known," he said. "No," she agreed. "But I could have looked more carefully. And I didn't." And I am sorry, she held his gaze. I want you to have the real apology, not the partial one. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached out and took her hand, simply, without ceremony, the way he did things that mattered to him, without the architecture of performance around them. Accepted, he said. Fully. Without qualification. They stood together at the rose wall in the June morning. After a while she said, "What are the papers, estate accounts, anything alarming, the opposite?" Graves left excellent records, a pause. Harris has also put in a formal request for an additional footman. Granted, she said. He's been doing 2 people's work for 3 months. I thought you'd say that. He looked at the papers. He also requests, this is a separate note, I'm not sure whether it's related, that Copernicus be formally acknowledged as a household resident rather than a guest, for purposes of the accounts. Vivienne considered this. What does formally acknowledging a cat involve precisely? I don't know. I suspect Harris has views. He always has views. Yes. A comfortable silence. The roses. The June light. Copernicus, who had apparently followed James from the house, was now sitting on the garden wall with the magnificent self-possession of a creature who had arranged his circumstances exactly as he intended and found them satisfactory. Vivienne looked at him. At the garden. At the house beyond it, gray stone and tall windows, familiar to her now in the way a place became familiar when it was yours. Not something to be observed, but something to be moved through without thinking. The way you moved through your own life without having to remember it. She thought about the woman who had arrived at the servant's entrance in November with a mended glove, and a letter of reference, and a determination to be invisible. She thought, you made it harder than it needed to be. She thought, but you got here. James's hand was warm in hers. The roses moved slightly in the morning air, a breath of it coming from the north, just enough to shift the petals. She had stood in this garden twice now. The first time she had walked away from something she hadn't understood and would spend 2 years learning the cost of. The second time, the real time, the one that counted, she had stayed. She was staying still. She thought she might stay for quite a long time. She had come to Elmsworth Park as a housekeeper, with a borrowed name and a mended glove and the specific, necessary courage of someone who has run out of alternatives. She had come expecting to be invisible. She had been instead seen, carefully, steadily, in the unhurried way of a man who looked at things properly or not at all, by the one person she had least expected to be seen by. She had polished the silver and managed the household and stood in the linen cupboard and cried once, quietly, and unpacked her bag and written a resignation letter she hadn't sent and said yes in a library with a French novel on the table. And somewhere in the middle of all of it she had become, without entirely planning to, exactly who she was. A woman who knew what she was looking at. A woman who looked carefully now. A woman standing in a June garden with roses on the wall and a husband beside her, and a cat on the fence who had also, in his way, arrived at exactly the right place through exactly the wrong door. She had once been certain about everything. She was certain now about one thing only. But it was, she had discovered, quite enough. We appreciate you staying with this story until the very last moment. If it kept you engaged, let us know where you're watching from. We genuinely enjoy reading those comments. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, shared with the same level of care, consider subscribing. Your support allows us to keep refining and bringing you new stories.